There is a darkness that exists only in the middle of a great body of water, a darkness that is not merely the absence of light, but the presence of a deep, suffocating void that seems to swallow sound, hope, and direction all at once. Before we descend into this terrifying night to witness the moment the laws of physics were suspended by the feet of a carpenter, may the Almighty God protect and bring abundance to those who subscribe and like this content for our efforts. It might seem simple to you, but it brings us great joy. Also, please mention in the comments which part of the world you are watching from, what emotion this story gave you, and do you believe? It will make us happy to reply to your comments. Now, let us return to the shores of Galilee, where the greatest miracle of provision was about to be followed by the greatest test of faith. The day had begun with a tragedy and ended with a triumph, a duality that often marked the ministry of the rabbi from Nazareth. The news of John the Baptist's death, beheaded by the capricious lust of Herod and the malice of Herodias, had cast a long, grim shadow over the morning. Jesus had sought solitude, a place to grieve the death of his cousin and the forerunner of the kingdom, but the crowds would not allow it. They were a relentless tide of humanity driven by hunger. Hunger for healing, hunger for words of life, and hunger for bread. 5,000 men, not counting the women and children, had swarmed the grassy slopes near Bethsaida, turning a desolate place into a teeming city of expectation. And he had fed them. It was a miracle that defied all logic, a multiplication of matter that broke the laws of thermodynamics. 5 barley loaves, the food of the poor, and 2 small fish had passed through his hands and become an inexhaustible fountain of sustenance. The disciples had distributed the food with trembling hands, watching the baskets refill themselves, their skepticism turning into bewilderment, and then into a giddy, intoxicating power. They were the distributors of the divine. They were the lieutenants of the Messiah. As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in hues of bruised purple and burning gold, the atmosphere on the hillside shifted from gratitude to revolution. The air was thick with a dangerous energy. The people were no longer just satisfied. They were energized. They whispered the word king. They looked at Jesus not just as a healer, but as a general who could feed an army without a supply train. If he could multiply bread, he could sustain a rebellion against Rome. If he could heal the wounded, he could make an army invincible. The murmur turned into a chant, a low rumble of insurrection that threatened to force him to take a crown he had not come to claim. Jesus saw it. He saw the political trap closing in. He saw the dark ambition igniting in the eyes of his own disciples. They were caught up in the fervor, their chests puffing out with pride. They were already measuring the drapes in the royal palace, forgetting the talk of crosses and suffering. To save them from this seduction, to save them from the poison of a false messiahship, he had to separate them from the crowd immediately. The command was abrupt and forceful. The Greek language preserves the intensity of the moment. He compelled them to get into the boat. It was not a suggestion. It was not a gentle request. It was an order given with the sharpness of a commander clearing a battlefield. Go, he told Peter, who was basking in the adoration of a group of men near the water. Get into the boat, now, row to Bethsaida, the disciples protested. Why leave now? The night was young. The moon was rising. It was the Passover season, so the moon would be full, a great silver eye watching over the lake. Why leave the scene of their greatest triumph? Why leave him behind? But Jesus would not be moved. He physically ushered them toward the shoreline, his hands firm on their shoulders, his eyes brooking no argument. He was sending them away like children being sent to bed while the adults discussed serious matters reluctantly. Confused and perhaps a little hurt, the 12 climbed into the wooden fishing boat. It was a sturdy vessel, familiar to them, smelling of tar and old fish. Peter took the rudder. James and John, the sons of thunder, took the lead oars. They pushed off, the gravel scraping against the hull, and drifted out into the dark glass of the Sea of Galilee. They looked back to see the silhouette of their master standing against the fading light, dismissing the thousands, diffusing the revolution with a word, sending the would-be army home to their beds. Then he turned his back on the sea and began to climb. Jesus ascended the mountain alone. He needed the high ground, not for strategic advantage, but for spiritual communion. He needed to breathe the air of the Father, to wash away the sticky projection of the crowd's desires. Up there, in the silence of the rocks and the wind, he knelt. But his prayer was not a withdrawal from the world. It was a watchtower. From his vantage point on the ridge, looking down into the bowl of the lake, he could see the dark speck of the boat moving slowly across the water. At first, the journey was easy. The water was calm, reflecting the moonlight like a mirror. The disciples, though disgruntled about being sent away, fell into the rhythm of rowing. The creak of the oarlocks and the splash of the blades were hypnotic. They talked about the bread, 12 baskets of leftovers, one for each of them. It was a sign, surely. They argued about who had distributed the most, who had seen the miracle first. They were high on the adrenaline of success, but the Sea of Galilee is a treacherous mistress. Sitting low in the Rift Valley, hundreds of feet below sea level, it is surrounded by steep ravines that act as funnels for the wind. The cool air from the heights rushes down to displace the warm air rising from the lake, creating sudden, violent storms known as katabatic winds. It began with a ripple, then a gust that ruffled the surface of the water, shattering the moon's reflection into 1,000 jagged shards. Then the roar. The wind did not come from behind them to speed them on their way. It came from the west, slamming directly into the bow of the boat. It was a contrary wind, a force of opposition. The boat shuddered, its forward momentum killed instantly. Peter shouted orders, his voice snatched away by the gale. Row harder. The easy rhythm was gone. Now it was a battle. Muscles strained against the resistance of the water. The waves, which moments ago had been gentle laps, stood up like angry walls. The water turned black, heaving and churning. The boat pitched violently, the bow slamming down into the troughs with bone-jarring force. Spray flew over the gunwales, soaking their tunics, chilling them to the bone. Hour after hour they fought. The first watch of the night passed, sunset to 9. They made little progress. The second watch, 9 to midnight. The wind howled louder, a demonic shriek that tore at their nerves. Their hands blistered and bled on the oars. Their backs screamed in protest. By the third watch, midnight to 3 in the morning, hope began to drain away with their strength. They were experienced sailors, at least 4 of them were. They knew this lake. They knew that a storm like this could last for days. They knew that boats like theirs could be swamped in an instant. They were barely halfway across, stuck in the middle of the abyss. The deep center of the lake, which the ancients believed was the gateway to the underworld, the home of Leviathan. The darkness was absolute now. Heavy storm clouds had obscured the moon, extinguishing the only light they had. They were blind, wet, exhausted, and terrified. And worse than the fear of death was the feeling of abandonment. Where was he? He had sent them into this. He had compelled them to get into the boat. Did he not know the storm was coming? Was he a prophet, or wasn't he? He fed us, Thomas might have shouted over the wind, spitting water from his mouth. And then he fed us to the sea. The bitterness of the thought was as cold as the spray. They felt used. They felt discarded. They were just servants, tools to be used for a miracle and then tossed aside when the weather turned. They rowed with the desperation of men who know that if they stop, they die. Then came the fourth watch, the darkest hour, between 3 and 6 in the morning. The time when the human spirit is at its lowest ebb, when the body's reserves are depleted, when the mind begins to hallucinate. The wind was still contrary. They were straining at the oars, making inches against miles of wind. They were exhausted beyond words. Their movements mechanical, fueled only by the primal instinct to survive. Then they saw it. It appeared in the distance, emerging from the mist and the spray. A shape, a figure. At first, Peter thought it was a trick of the eye, a phantasm caused by fatigue and fear. He blinked, wiping the stinging salt water from his lashes. But the shape remained. It was not a boat. There were no sails, no hull, no splashing of oars. It was upright, vertical. It was walking. Terror, cold and primal, seized the hearts of the 12 men. In the folklore of the sea, seeing a figure walking on the water meant only one thing: a spirit of the deep, a harbinger of doom, a ghost coming to claim the souls of drowning men. The storm could kill their bodies, but a ghost, a phantasma, could claim their eternal souls. It is a ghost, they screamed. The cry was one of sheer, unadulterated panic. Rugged fishermen, men who wrangled nets and gutted fish, huddled together like frightened children. They forgot the bread, they forgot the healings, they forgot their theology. In the face of the supernatural breaking into the natural world, they were reduced to screaming animals. The figure moved with an impossible grace. The waves were cresting 5-6 feet high, crashing and foaming, but the figure did not bob or weave. He walked on the chaos as if it were a marble floor. He trod upon the ridges of the waves, the very symbol of uncontrollable power, and flattened them with his footsteps. And here lies the strangest, most terrifying detail of the night. The detail that Mark, recording Peter's memory, refused to leave out. He meant to pass by them. He was not walking directly toward the boat to save them. He was not rushing to their rescue. He was walking on a trajectory that would take him past them. He was cutting across the lake, ignoring the laws of nature. And he intended to keep going. Why? To understand this, we must look back to the ancient scriptures that these men knew in their bones. When Moses asked to see God's glory, God hid him in the cleft of a rock and said, "I will make all my goodness pass before you." When Elijah stood on the mountain, the Lord passed by in the wind and the fire. In the Hebrew mind, for God to pass by was not an act of ignoring. It was an act of revelation. It was a theophany. It was God showing himself as the master of the elements. Job had said of God, "He alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea." Jesus was not just coming to fix their weather problem. He was revealing his identity. By intending to pass them by, he was showing them that he was the Yahweh of the Old Testament, the one who walks on the chaos, the one who is not subject to the storm but is the master of it. He was giving them a glimpse of his divinity that was far greater than multiplied bread. But the disciples did not see Yahweh. They saw a ghost. They saw their death approaching in the mist. They shrieked again, a collective wail of despair that rose above the howling wind. They were terrified not of the storm anymore, but of the Savior. They did not recognize him. The very answer to their prayers was walking toward them, and they mistook it for a monster. Jesus heard their scream. He saw their terror, and in that moment, his intention changed. He would not pass them by. He could not leave them in that state of horror. The revelation of his glory would have to be tempered with the comfort of his presence. He turned. He pivoted on the shifting surface of the water and began to walk directly toward the boat. The figure grew larger, clearer. The wind whipped his robes around him, but he stood solid. He was close enough now that they could see he was not transparent. He was not a mist. He was solid matter. Then he spoke. His voice did not need to shout to be heard over the gale. It cut through the noise of the wind and the waves, just as it had cut through the noise of the demon-possessed man in the synagogue. It was the voice that spoke the world into existence. "Take heart," he said. "It is I, do not be afraid." It is I, in the Greek, ego eimi. Literally, I am, the divine name. The name given to Moses at the burning bush. I am that I am. He was standing on the water, the chaotic abyss that threatened to swallow them, and announcing that he was the self-existent God. The waves did not disturb him because he created the water. The wind did not push him because he invented the air. Peter, crouching by the gunwale, clutching the wet wood until his knuckles were white, heard the voice. It sounded like Jesus. It looked like Jesus, but how could it be? People do not walk on water. It is physically impossible. Unless he is who he says he is. A wild, desperate thought began to form in Peter's mind. It was a thought born of the same impulsiveness that would later make him draw a sword against a battalion. The same reckless love that would make him jump into the sea to swim to shore. It was a test. If it is a ghost, it will kill me. If it is Jesus, he will sustain me. Peter stood up in the rocking boat. The others looked at him as if he had lost his mind. The boat was pitching violently, yet Peter let go of the mast. He cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted into the teeth of the storm. "Lord," Peter cried, "if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." It was an audacious request. He didn't say, "Lord, come in the boat." He said, "Let me do what you are doing." He wanted to participate in the miracle. He wanted to step out of the passive role of the victim and into the active role of the supernatural. Jesus looked at Peter. He saw the fear, yes, but he also saw the spark of faith. He saw the one man in the boat who was willing to leave the illusion of safety for the reality of the impossible. Jesus smiled. One word, that was all he gave. He didn't give a lecture on hydrodynamics. He didn't give a theological treatise. He gave a command that was also an enablement. Come, the word hung in the air, suspended between the howling wind and the crashing waves. Come. Peter looked down. The water was black, deep, and terrifying. It was the killer. It was the grave. To step out of the boat was suicide. The boat, as leaky and tossed as it was the only thing keeping him alive. It represented all human security, all man-made systems of survival. To step out was to abandon common sense, logic, and self-preservation, but the voice had said, "Come." Peter swung one leg over the side of the boat. The water splashed against his calf, cold and biting. He swung the other leg over. He was holding onto the gunwale with both hands, his body hanging over the abyss. The disciples watched in breathless horror. John reached out a hand to grab him, but pulled it back. Peter let go. His feet hit the surface. He expected the plunge. He expected the water to give way, for the cold to swallow him, for the water to fill his lungs. He braced himself for the drowning, but he didn't sink. The water felt solid. Not like ice, but like firm earth. It yielded slightly under his weight, but held him up. The surface tension of the water had been hardened by the word of the Master. Peter stood. He stood on the face of the deep. He looked up. Jesus was standing there, perhaps 10 yards away, beckoning him. Peter took a step. Then another. He was walking. He was doing the impossible. He was operating in a dimension where the laws of nature were subservient to the laws of faith. The storm was still raging, the waves were still crashing, but Peter was walking on top of them. For a brief, glorious moment, Peter was more than a fisherman. He was a son of God, exercising dominion over the created order. But then, the tragedy of the human condition reasserted itself. Peter was doing it. He was halfway to Jesus, But then a massive wave rose up to his right, blocking his view of the master. The wind shrieked in his ear, throwing spray into his eyes. He took his eyes off Jesus. He looked at the wind. He looked at the waves. He looked at the reality of his situation through the lens of fear rather than the lens of faith. His mind began to calculate the impossibility of what he was doing. I am a heavy man, this is water. This cannot support me. The moment he analyzed the miracle evaporated. The moment he gave more weight to the storm than to the word ceased to hold him. He felt the water turn back into liquid. The solidity vanished. His feet slipped. The cold rushed up his legs. He plunged down, the water filling his mouth. The weight of his soaked tunic dragging him into the abyss. He didn't have time for a prayer. He didn't have time for a confession. He had time for 3 words. The shortest, most urgent prayer in the Bible. Lord, save me. It was a gurgle, a scream, a desperate plea from a dying man. Jesus did not hesitate. He did not wait for Peter to drown a little bit to teach him a lesson. He did not lecture him on physics while he sank immediately. There is that word again. Jesus reached out his hand. He caught him. The grip was iron. It was the hand of a carpenter, strong and calloused, but it was also the hand of God. Jesus pulled Peter up out of the water, back onto the surface that was solid only for him. He held Peter close, the 2 of them standing there in the middle of the furious sea, the only 2 stable points in a universe of chaos. Jesus looked into Peter's terrified, sputtering face. He didn't look with anger. He looked with sadness. "O you of little faith," Jesus said, his voice cutting through the storm. "Why did you doubt? Why did you doubt?" He didn't. "Why did you sink?" He asked why he doubted. The sinking was just the symptom. The doubt was the disease. Peter had been doing it. He had been walking. The doubt was an irrational return to a lower reality. And then, arm in arm, the master and the disciple walked back to the boat. This is the part that often gets missed. Jesus didn't carry Peter. He didn't teleport them. They walked back. Peter walked on the water again, this time held by Jesus. They reached the boat. The 11 other disciples, jaws agape, reached out to pull them in. Peter tumbled over the gunwale, coughing up water, shivering, humbled, but alive. Jesus stepped in after him. And the very second Jesus' foot touched the deck of the boat, the wind ceased. It didn't taper off. It didn't die down slowly. It stopped, complete utter silence. The waves lay down like obedient dogs. The stars came out. The lake became glass again. The disciples sat in the sudden stillness, the sound of their own heavy breathing filling the air. They looked at the calm water. They looked at Peter soaking wet. They looked at Jesus, who was wringing the water from the hem of his robe. They had seen him heal. They had seen him multiply bread. But this was different. This was mastery over the primal elements. This was the authority of the Creator. They did not ask him for bread. They did not ask him for positions of power. For the first time, they truly understood who was in the boat with them. They fell down. They worshipped him. Truly, they whispered. The fear of the ghost replaced by the awe of the divine. You are the Son of God. The boat drifted in the silence toward the shore of Gennesaret. The night was over, but the lesson of the storm had just begun. For in the heart of the disciple, the storm is never just about the wind and the waves. It is about the terrifying, wonderful presence of the one who passes by, the one who calls us out of the boat, and the one who catches us when we fall. The ghost was gone, but the God remained. The keel of the boat scraped against the pebbled bottom of the shallows, a gritty grounding sound that signaled the end of the impossible night. The sun was just cresting the ridges of the Golan Heights, spilling a pale, diluted gold across the surface of the water. Water that lay flat and innocent now, betraying nothing of the fury it had held only hours before. To the casual observer walking the shoreline of Gennesaret, the boat looked like any other fishing vessel returning from a night's labor, battered by the elements, smelling of brine and wet wood. But the men inside were not the same men who had departed Bethsaida the evening prior. They moved with the stiff, mechanical slowness of those who have touched the veil of the afterlife and been sent back. Peter was the first to step out. His tunic was still heavy with seawater, clinging to his skin, shivering not from the morning chill but from the aftershocks of adrenaline. He looked at his feet as they sank into the wet sand, solid ground. The sensation was overwhelming. Just hours ago, these same feet had found purchase on the shifting face of the abyss, held up by a word. Now they obeyed gravity again. He looked back at Jesus, who was stepping from the boat with a quiet, unassuming grace. The rabbi's face showed no trace of the exertion of the mountain prayer or the mastery of the storm. He looked human, terrifyingly human, which made the memory of the phantom on the waves all the more disorienting. They had landed at Gennesaret, a fertile, densely populated plain on the northwest shore of the lake. It was a garden region, rich with walnut trees, palms, and olives. a stark contrast to the desolate slopes where they had fed the 5,000. Here, life teemed, and here anonymity was impossible. The moment the boat was secured, the recognition began. It started with a single fisherman mending his nets nearby. He squinted, dropped his needle, and stood up. Then a woman drawing water froze, her pitcher halfway to her shoulder. The whisper spread like a grass fire in a dry wind. It is him, the prophet, the healer. Within minutes the tranquility of the morning was shattered. People began to run. They ran through the whole region, shouting the news into doorways and courtyards. He is here, bring the sick. The scene that unfolded was a frenzy of human desperation. They did not come for theology. They did not come to hear about the kingdom of God. They came for relief. They carried the sick on mats, running alongside the disciples as they tried to make their way inland. They brought the lame, the blind, the fever-ridden. The air filled with the sounds of groaning, weeping, and the frantic pleas of mothers holding limp children. And they did something strange, something that spoke of a shift in the collective consciousness of the crowd. They did not ask for him to lay hands on them. They did not ask for a word of command. The rumor had spread, perhaps from the woman with the issue of blood who had been healed months before, that power resided in the very fibers of his clothing. They begged only to touch the fringe of his garment, the asterisk, tzit asterisk, the tassels on the corners of his prayer shawl, representing the commandments of God, became the focal point of their faith. Jesus moved through the crushing throngs, and it was a river of misery flowing around him. Hands reached out from the dust, gnarled hands, wasted hands, fever-hot hands, brushing against the hem of his robe, and as many as touched it were made well. It was a wholesale impartation of life. There were no interviews, no requirements of faith, just a raw physical connection to the source of vitality. The disciples acted as a buffer, pushing back the crowd to keep Jesus from being crushed, but their hearts were heavy. They saw the transaction. The people took the healing, but they did not take the healer. They wanted the gift, not the giver. It was the same spirit as the bread on the other side of the lake. Consume, benefit, and move on. Jesus healed them with a compassion that was inexhaustible. But his eyes were scanning the horizon, looking toward Capernaum. He knew that the other crowd, the one he had fed, the one that wanted to make him king, was not done with him yet. Across the lake near Bethsaida, the sun had fully risen, revealing a mystery to the thousands who had camped out in the hopes of more miraculous bread. They rubbed the sleep from their eyes and looked for the prophet. He was gone. This was puzzling. They knew there had been only one boat the night before, and they had watched the disciples leave in it without Jesus. They had seen him go up the mountain. So where was he? He couldn't have walked around the lake. It was too far to traverse in a night, and he hadn't taken a boat. While they debated this impossibility, boats from Tiberias arrived, blown in by the same gale that had nearly drowned the disciples. Driven by a hunger that was now gnawing at their bellies and a curiosity that burned in their minds, the crowd commandeered these boats. They set sail for Capernaum, the center of his ministry. Hunting him down like a prize, they found him in the synagogue of Capernaum. It was the Sabbath or close to it, and the limestone building was packed. The air inside was cool and dim, smelling of old parchment and stone dust, a sanctuary from the relentless Galilean sun. When the mob from Bethsaida burst in, breathless and confused, they disrupted the solemnity of the gathering. They spotted Jesus sitting in the teacher's seat, calm and composed. "Rabbi," they blurted out, their voices echoing off the stone walls. "When did you come here?" It was a simple question, but it was loaded with suspicion. How did you trick us? How did you slip the net? They wanted the logistics of the miracle, not the meaning. They wanted to know the trick so they could control the magician. Jesus looked at them. He did not answer their question. He did not tell them about the walking on water. That revelation was for the disciples, for the inner circle who had faced the storm. For this crowd he had a different, harder truth. He stripped away their pretense with a surgical strike at their motives. "Truly, truly, I say to you," Jesus said, his voice resonating with that terrifying authority, "you are seeking me, not because you saw signs, but because you ate your fill of the loaves." The accusation hung in the air. "You are not here for God. You are here for your stomachs. You are here because I fixed your biological problem for an afternoon. You saw the miracle, the sign, but you didn't read what the sign was pointing to. You stopped at the bread. Do not work for the food that perishes," he commanded, "but for the food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. For on him God the Father has set his seal." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. They didn't like being called out. They were religious people. They felt they were doing the work of God by chasing down a prophet. They went on the defensive, falling back on the language of works and religious duty. "What must we do to be doing the works of God?" they asked. "Give us the list. Tell us the rules. If we do the tasks, then you give us the bread. That is the contract. This is the work of God, Jesus replied, simplifying the entire complex structure of halakhic law into a single point of singularity, that you believe in him whom he has sent. Belief, trust, allegiance, not earning but receiving. But the crowd was not satisfied. They wanted a negotiation. If he wanted their allegiance, he had to keep the supply line open. They played their trump card, their history, their greatest national memory. Then what sign do you do that we may see and believe you? They challenged. What work do you perform? Our fathers ate the manna in the wilderness. As it is written, he gave them bread from heaven to eat. It was a direct challenge. Moses gave us manna every day for 40 years. You gave us barley bread once. If you are the greater Moses, if you are the Messiah, up your game. Open the windows of heaven. Rain down the bread. Do that and we will believe. Jesus stood up. The time for soft metaphors was over. He was about to draw a line in the sand that would separate the true from the false, the living from the dead. Truly, truly, I say to you, it was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Sir, give us this bread always, they said. They still thought he was talking about a superior baked good, a magical loaf that never went stale. Then Jesus dropped the hammer. He looked at them, the hungry mob, the skeptical religious leaders, his own exhausted disciples, and he uttered the words that would shatter his popularity forever. I am the bread of life. The silence in the synagogue was absolute. I am, ego eimi, the same words he had spoken on the water. Your fathers ate the manna in the wilderness and they died, he continued. This is the bread that comes down from heaven, so that one may eat of it and not die. I am the living bread that came down from heaven. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh. The reaction was visceral. A murmur of disgust rippled through the room. The Jews, the leaders of the synagogue, began to dispute among themselves. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? It was repulsive. It sounded like cannibalism. It violated every Levitical law regarding blood and the sanctity of the body. It was madness. Who talks like this? Eat my flesh. It was a stumbling block so large it seemed insurmountable, but Jesus did not back down. He did not say, oh, it's just a metaphor, don't worry. He pressed harder. He made it more offensive. He switched the Greek verb from phago, to eat, to trogo, to gnaw, to chew. He made it graphic. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless you eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you have no life in you. He was dismantling their entire religious framework. They wanted a Messiah who would conquer Rome. He offered a Messiah who would be broken like bread. They wanted a kingdom of glory. He offered a kingdom of sacrifice. He was telling them that to have life they had to internalize him completely. They had to accept his death, his broken body and spilled blood, as their only source of survival. It wasn't about following his moral teachings. It was about participating in his sacrifice. The tension in the room was suffocating. The air felt thin, just as it had on the mountain. But here there was no light, only the heavy weight of a truth too hard to bear. The crowd from Bethsaida, the ones who had chased him across the lake, began to back away. This wasn't what they signed up for. They wanted the king who walked on water, not the victim who talked about blood. Even the wider circle of disciples, not the 12, but the 70 or so who followed him, were shaken. They whispered in the corners, "This is a hard saying, who can listen to it?" It wasn't just hard to understand, it was hard to accept. It was offensive. It stripped them of their autonomy. It demanded a total surrender to a man who sounded insane. Jesus knew their thoughts. He knew that the winnowing fork was in his hand. He looked at his followers, the ones who had been with him for months. "Do you take offense at this?" he asked. "Then what if you were to see the Son of Man ascending to where he was before? It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh is no help at all. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life. But there are some of you who do not believe." He knew. He knew who was there for the miracle, and who was there for the Master. He knew who was a tourist and who was a pilgrim. And then, the Exodus began. It was a tragic procession. One by one, then in groups, the disciples turned their backs. The crowd from Bethsaida left, grumbling about wasted time. The religious leaders left, tearing their robes in indignation at the blasphemy. The synagogue emptied. The dust motes danced in the shafts of light that cut through the silence. The noise of the multitude faded into the distance. Jesus stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded only by the 12. The men who had been in the boat, the men who had seen the ghost turn into God. He turned to them. His eyes were not pleading. He was not begging them to stay to boost his numbers. He was offering them the freedom to leave. The door was open. "Do you want to go away as well?" he asked. It was the most dangerous question he ever asked them. It was the moment where the movement could have ended. If they left, it was over. The silence stretched. Peter looked at the other 11. He saw the confusion in Thomas's eyes, the calculation in Judas's, the fear in Andrew's. They were terrified by the teaching. They didn't understand the eating flesh any more than the crowd did. It was offensive to them too, but Peter had a memory that the crowd didn't have. He had the sensation of water under his feet. He had the memory of a hand gripping his forearm when he was drowning. He knew that outside of this man, there was only the abyss. There was only the storm. Peter stepped forward. He spoke for the 12, and he spoke for every believer who would come after them in the long corridors of history. "Lord, to whom shall we go?" It was an admission of helplessness. "We don't understand everything you say. You scare us. You offend our minds. But we have nowhere else. The world has nothing for us. The synagogue has nothing. Rome has nothing. You have the words of eternal life," Peter continued, his voice strengthening. "And we have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God." The confession hung in the air, a fragile but unbreakable bond. They stayed not because it was easy, but because it was true. They stayed because they had seen his glory on the water, and they could not unsee it. Jesus looked at them with a love that was tempered by a dark knowledge. He accepted their confession, but he would not let them be comfortable. He knew the seeds of betrayal were already sown, even in this inner sanctum. "Did I not choose you, the 12? Jesus said softly, his eyes passing over Judas Iscariot, who stood in the shadows near a pillar, silent, his face unreadable. "And yet one of you is a devil." A chill went through the group. They looked at each other, wondering. The storm on the lake was over, but a greater storm was gathering. A storm of betrayal, of blood, of a cross. The eating of flesh was not a metaphor. It was a prophecy. The days that followed marked a shift in the ministry. The crowds were smaller now. The celebrity was gone, replaced by a growing infamy. The scribes and Pharisees from Jerusalem arrived, not to investigate but to condemn. They attacked him on ritual purity, on hand-washing, on the traditions of the elders. The atmosphere in Galilee had turned toxic. Jesus, sensing the closing of the net, decided it was time to withdraw. He needed to take the 12 away from the pressure cooker of Jewish expectation, away from the Herod who wanted to kill him and the crowd that wanted to crown him. He looked north, toward the coast, toward the ancient pagan cities of Tyre and Sidon. It was Gentile territory, unclean land, a place where the bread of life was not expected to be broken. "We go north," he told them. The journey was a retreat, a seeking of anonymity. They walked through the hill country, leaving the Sea of Galilee behind. The disciples were quiet, processing the trauma of the lake and the scandal of the synagogue. They felt like outcasts. Following an outcast god, they arrived in the region of Tyre, a land of Phoenicians, worshippers of Baal and Astarte. Jesus entered a house, hoping to stay hidden. He would have no one know it, the record says. He was tired. He needed to prepare the 12 for the end. But he could not be hid. The scent of life cannot be contained. Even in this dark pagan land, the rumor of him had arrived. A woman heard he was there. She was a Syrophoenician by birth, a Greek in culture, a Gentile in religion. She was everything a Jewish rabbi should avoid, but she was also a mother. And she had a daughter at home who was grievously vexed with a demon. An unclean spirit for an unclean land. She came to the house. She violated every social norm. She stood at the door and began to cry out, "Have mercy on me, O Lord, Son of David. My daughter is severely oppressed by a demon." She used the Jewish title, Son of David. She knew who he was. She had heard the stories. Jesus did something that baffled the disciples. He ignored her. He did not answer her a word. He sat in the house, silent. The woman kept crying out, her voice rising in pitch and desperation. The disciples, annoyed and embarrassed by this scene in a foreign land, begged him, "Send her away, for she is crying out after us." They wanted her gone. She was a nuisance. She was a reminder of the need they couldn't meet. Jesus finally spoke, but his words seemed harsh, exclusionary. He looked at the disciples, not the woman. "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." It was a theological wall. "I'm here for the Jews. My mission is specific." But the woman would not be deterred. She pushed past the disciples. She entered the room. She fell at his feet and worshipped him. "Lord, help me," she whispered. Jesus looked down at her. He decided to test her faith, to see if it was the shallow entitlement of the Galilean crowd or something deeper. He used a cultural proverb, one that sounded insulting to modern ears, but was a challenge in that context. "It is not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." He called her a dog. Not the wild scavengers of the street, *kuon*, but the little pet dogs, *kunarian*, that lived under the table. But still a dog. He was saying, the blessings of the kingdom belong to the covenant people. You are outside. The disciples held their breath. This was it. She would leave in anger, she would curse him, but the woman looked up. She didn't argue theology, she didn't claim rights she didn't have. She accepted her position, but she laid claim to his character. She laid claim to the abundance of his table. Yes, Lord, she said. I agree, I am a dog. I don't deserve the place of a son. Yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table. It was a brilliant, humble, faith-filled riposte. She was saying, your table is so rich, your power is so great that I don't need a loaf. I don't need a banquet. Just a crumb of your power is enough to break the hell off my daughter. Just the leftovers. Jesus smiled. The gloom of the rejection in Capernaum lifted from his face. Here, in a pagan land, he found what he couldn't find in Israel. Here was someone who understood the economics of grace. "O woman, great is your faith," Jesus exclaimed. "Be it done for you as you desire." He spoke the word. He didn't need to go to her house. The distance didn't matter. The demon, miles away, shuddered and fled before the authority of the crumb. For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter. The woman left, not with a promise of political revolution, but with a healed child. The disciples watched her go, humbled again. They had wanted to send her away. Jesus had wanted to draw her faith out. They were learning that the bread of life was not just for the Jews, it was for the hungry, whoever they were. From Tyre, they moved to Sidon, and then circled back through the Decapolis, the 10 cities, toward the Sea of Galilee. They were taking the long way around, avoiding the territory of Herod Antipas. They were walking through the Gentile lands, sowing seeds that the apostles would later harvest in the Decapolis, a region of Greek culture and pagan temples. They brought him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. The crowd begged him to lay his hand on him. Jesus took him aside from the multitude privately. He didn't want a show. He put his fingers into the man's ears. He spat and touched his tongue. It was intimate, earthy. Then, looking up to heaven, he sighed. That sigh. It was the groan of the Creator looking at the brokenness of his creation. It was the sorrow of the man who walked on water, knowing he would drown in the sin of the world. Ephphatha, he said, Aramaic. Be opened. And immediately the man's ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. The crowds in the Decapolis were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak." They were saying what Isaiah had prophesied. The kingdom was breaking in, but as they returned to the Sea of Galilee, the shadow of the cross lengthened. The withdrawal was over. They were heading back into the storm. But this time the storm wasn't wind and waves. It was the Pharisees and Sadducees united in their hatred. Demanding a sign from heaven, Jesus stood on the shore of Magadan. The water lapped at his feet, the same water he had walked on. The Pharisees approached, their robes crisp, their faces hard. "Teacher," they sneered, "we wish to see a sign from you." They wanted a circus trick. They wanted him to write in the sky. Jesus looked at them with a deep, burning anger. He groaned in his spirit. An evil and adulterous generation seeks for a sign, but no sign will be given to it except the sign of Jonah. Jonah, the prophet who went into the belly of the whale and came out 3 days later. Jesus was pointing to the end. He was pointing to the grave. He left them and got into the boat again. "Let us go to the other side." In the boat, the disciples realized they had forgotten to bring bread. They had 1 loaf. They began to argue about it. "Who forgot the bread? How will we eat?" Jesus looked at them. After the 5,000, after the 4,000 which had happened in the Decapolis, after the walking on water, they were still worried about lunch. "Watch and beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees," he warned. They thought he was talking about baking. "O you of little faith," Jesus said, echoing the words he spoke to Peter on the waves. "Why are you discussing among yourselves the fact that you have no bread? Do you not yet perceive? Do you not remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many baskets you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000? He was pleading with them to see the reality he lived in. "I am the bread. I am the supply. I am the I am. How is it that you fail to understand that I did not speak about bread?" Then they understood. The leaven was the teaching, the cynicism, the legalism, the demand for signs without faith. They sailed on. The boat cut through the water. The disciples fell silent, watching the wake. They were slow of heart, yes. They were fearful, but they were in the boat with him. And as they looked at his back, bent against the wind, they knew that wherever this boat was going, whether to a crown or a cross, there was nowhere else in the universe they would rather be. The ghost had become their guide, and the bread had become their life. The water beneath them was deep, but his grace was deeper still. And so they rowed, strokes of faith against the current of the world, heading toward the final destination, Jerusalem. The keel of the boat scraped against the rocky shoreline of Bethsaida, bringing the disciples back to the harsh, gray reality of land. The water behind them was calm now, a sheet of glass that betrayed no memory of the phantom footsteps or the raging wind. But the internal storm within the 12 had not yet subsided. They stepped onto the shore with the heaviness of men who had seen too much. The lesson of the leaven, the warning against the infectious cynicism of the Pharisees, was still echoing in their ears. But their minds were preoccupied with the terrifying duality of the master they followed. He was the shepherd who fed them, yet he was also the stranger who walked on the abyss. Bethsaida was a place of familiar shadows for several of the disciples. It was the hometown of Peter, Andrew, and Philip. Yet as Jesus led them through the winding, dusty streets, the town felt different. It was no longer home. It was a place of unbelief, a city that had witnessed mighty works and yet remained unchanged. Jesus took them by the hand quite literally, when a group of villagers brought a blind man to him. They begged for a touch, a quick fix, similar to the crowds at Gennesaret. But Jesus did not heal the man in the town square. He took the blind man by the arm and led him out of the village. It was a stark, silent judgment on Bethsaida. He would not perform the miracle amidst the leaven of that place. Once they were outside in the quiet of the open fields, Jesus performed a miracle that mirrored the spiritual state of his own disciples. He spat on the man's eyes and laid his hands on him. "Do you see anything?" Jesus asked. The man blinked, his milky eyes clearing slightly. "I see people, but they look like trees walking." It was a partial sight. He saw forms, he saw movement, but he could not distinguish the reality of the person from the shadows of the landscape. It was a perfect metaphor for Peter and the others. They had seen Jesus walking on the water, but in their terror, they had mistaken him for a ghost. They saw the Messiah, but they saw him through the lens of their own fears and expectations. A tree walking, a phantom floating, a conqueror conquering. They needed a second touch. Jesus laid his hands on the man's eyes again. This time, when the man opened them, he saw everything clearly. The trees were trees, and the men were men. Jesus sent him home with a specific command: do not even enter the village. The clarity of vision was something that had to be protected from the fog of the world. The disciples watched this in silence, understanding that they too were in the middle of a process. They had received the first touch. They knew he was the Holy One of God, but their vision was still blurry. They still saw a political king where there was a suffering servant. From Bethsaida, Jesus led them north, far away from the Jewish crowds and the pressure of Galilee. They ascended into the region of Caesarea Philippi, a place that stood in the shadow of Mount Hermon. The landscape here changed dramatically. The rolling hills of Galilee gave way to massive cliffs of red limestone and lush green vegetation fed by the springs that formed the source of the Jordan River. But it was not a holy place. It was the center of pagan worship. The city was dominated by a massive marble temple dedicated to the divinity of Caesar Augustus, built by Herod the Great. And carved into the sheer rock face of the cliff was a deep, dark cavern known as the Grotto of Pan. This cave was filled with water, a bottomless pit, the locals said, and was believed to be a gateway to the underworld. It was literally called the Gates of Hades. Statues of the goat god Pan, the god of panic and wild nature, stared down from niches in the rock. It was here, against the backdrop of idols, imperial power, and the gates of hell, that Jesus chose to clarify their vision. He stopped the group. The roar of the water rushing from the cave filled the air. He looked at the 12 who were gazing uneasily at the pagan shrines. "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" he asked. It was a safe question. It allowed them to report the gossip without committing themselves. They answered readily. "Some say John the Baptist, risen from the dead." That was Herod's fear. Others say Elijah, the forerunner of the apocalypse. Others Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. It was the trees' walking answer. The people saw power, they saw holiness, but they saw it through the hazy lens of the past. They could only define Jesus by comparing him to dead men. "But who do you say that I am?" Jesus asked. The question was a scalpel cutting through the hearsay. He looked at them with the same intensity he had shown on the stormy sea when he said, "It is I." The silence stretched. The wind rustled the leaves of the oak trees. The idols of Pan stared down with stony eyes. Then Peter, the one who had walked on the water, the one who had sunk and been saved, stepped forward. He looked past the carpenter's clothes, past the dusty feet, past the exhaustion of the journey. He saw clearly. "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." It was the second touch. The blurriness vanished. He was not a ghost. He was not a prophet. He was the finality of God's speech to man. Jesus looked at Peter with a profound approval. "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, For flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Jesus gestured, perhaps toward the dark, gaping maw of the grotto of Pan behind them. The gates of death, the portals of the underworld that terrified the ancients, would not be able to withstand the offensive advance of this new community. The disciples felt a surge of triumph. Here it was, the declaration of war, the promise of victory, but the clarity of vision brought a terrifying new reality. Now that they knew who he was, he had to tell them what he would do. He began to show them that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. The words fell on them like stones. Suffer, killed. This did not fit the confession. The Christ was the victor, not the victim. The Christ conquers the gates of hell. He does not get swallowed by them. Peter, flushed with the confidence of his recent acclamation, felt the need to correct this error. He took Jesus aside, pulling him away from the others as if to spare the master the embarrassment of his own pessimism. "Far be it from you, Lord. This shall never happen to you." It was the ghost of the storm returning. It was the voice of fear masquerading as protection. Peter was looking at the waves again, not the master. He was calculating the odds. A dead Messiah was a failed Messiah. Jesus turned. He did not look at Peter alone. He looked at the disciples, making sure they all heard. The approval of moments ago vanished, replaced by a fierce, protective anger. He saw the shadow of the tempter standing behind Peter's shoulder. The same spirit that had offered him the kingdoms of the world in the wilderness if he would only bypass the cross. "Get behind me, Satan, you are a hindrance to me. For you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man." The rebuke was shattering. Peter recoiled as if struck. Moments ago he was the rock. Now he was the stumbling stone. The lesson was brutal. To understand the identity of Jesus was one thing, to understand his mission was another. The way up was down. The way to life was death. The walking on water was not a parlor trick to prove invincibility. It was a demonstration that he could go through the abyss and emerge on the other side. From Caesarea Philippi, the shadow of the cross fell long over their path. The journey turned south again, back toward Galilee. But this time they moved in secret. Jesus did not want the crowds. He focused entirely on the 12, hammering the reality of the coming passion into their resistant minds. They walked through the back roads, sleeping in the open fields, avoiding the villages where the demand for bread would distract from the demand for blood. As the autumn approached, the roads began to fill with pilgrims heading to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. This was the most joyous of all Jewish festivals, the Feast of the Harvest, the Feast of Lights and Water. It commemorated the wilderness wanderings when Israel lived in tents, and God provided water from the rock. The brothers of Jesus, sons of Mary who had grown up with him but remained skeptical of his claims, goaded him. "Leave here and go to Judea, that your disciples also may see the works you are doing. For no one works in secret if he seeks to be known openly. If you do these things, show yourself to the world." They were taunting him with his own obscurity. "You walk on water in the dark. You feed peasants in the wilderness. If you are the king, go to the capital. Go to the stage." Jesus looked at them with a detached sadness. "My time has not yet come, but your time is always here. The world cannot hate you, but it hates me because I testify about it that its works are evil. You go up to the feast. I am not going up to this feast, for my time has not yet fully come." He waited. He let the caravan of pilgrims, including his brothers, disappear down the Jordan Valley. He let the dust settle, and then he went up, not openly, but in secret. It was a journey of stealth. He moved like a phantom through the countryside, avoiding the main thoroughfares, perhaps traveling by night. He was entering the lion's den, but he would do it on his own terms. Jerusalem during the Feast of Tabernacles was a spectacle of light and sound. The city swelled to triple its size. Booths made of palm and leafy branches were constructed on every rooftop and in every courtyard. The smell of roasting meat and etrog, the citrus fruit of the harvest, filled the air. But beneath the celebration there was a current of tension. The authorities were hunting him. They whispered in the colonnades of the temple, "Where is he?" The crowds were divided, muttering, "He is a good man," or, "No, he is leading the people astray." Suddenly, in the middle of the feast, Jesus appeared in the temple. He didn't arrive with a fanfare. He simply materialized in the courts and began to teach. The reaction was shock. How does this man know letters, having never studied? The brilliance of his teaching mesmerized the crowd, but his presence terrified them. They knew the rulers wanted to kill him, yet here he was, speaking openly. The tension culminated on the last day of the feast, the great day. On this day, a priest would take a golden pitcher, go down to the pool of Siloam, fill it with water, and process back to the temple. He would pour the water onto the altar while the people recited Isaiah. With joy you will draw water from the wells of salvation. It was a prayer for rain, but also a prayer for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit. As the water splashed onto the stone altar, glistening in the sun, Jesus stood up. He did not just speak. He cried out, his voice ringing over the chanting of the priests, "If anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as the scripture has said, out of his heart will flow rivers of living water." It was the echo of the lake. I am the master of the water. He was declaring himself to be the rock in the wilderness, the source of the Spirit. He was the fulfillment of the ritual they were performing. The water in the golden pitcher was just a symbol. He was the substance. The authorities sent officers to arrest him. These were hardened temple guards, men used to dragging unruly zealots out of the sacred precincts. They pushed through the crowd, hands on their clubs. They got close enough to hear him. They stopped. They listened. They watched the face of the man who spoke of living water, and they couldn't do it. Their hands went limp. They turned around and went back to the priests empty-handed. "Why did you not bring him?" the Pharisees demanded. Furious, the officers looked at the ground, ashamed of their failure but unable to deny their experience. No one ever spoke like this man. It wasn't just his rhetoric. It was the authority. It was the same authority that had silenced the wind. You cannot arrest a hurricane. Night fell over Jerusalem. During the Feast of Tabernacles, 4 massive golden lampstands, each 50 cubits high, were lit in the court of women. They were said to produce so much light that every courtyard in Jerusalem was illuminated. It was a celebration of the pillar of fire that led Israel through the night. Men danced before the lamps with burning torches, singing songs of praise. It was into this blaze of artificial light that the scribes and Pharisees brought a woman. They dragged her through the court, humiliated, terrified, her clothes torn. They had caught her in the act of adultery, a trap set with human bait. They threw her down in the center of the crowd, right in front of Jesus. "Teacher," they said, their voices dripping with feigned piety, "this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. So what do you say?" It was the perfect trap. If he said stone her, he violated Roman law, which forbade Jews from carrying out capital punishment, and he lost his reputation as the friend of sinners. If he said let her go, he violated the law of Moses and proved himself a false prophet. The crowd went silent. The torches flickered, casting long dancing shadows. The woman huddled in the dirt, waiting for the first blow. She was nothing to them, just a pawn in their game to destroy the Galilean. Jesus bent down. He did not look at the accusers. He looked at the earth. He used his finger to write in the dust. It was a strange, deliberate action. The silence stretched. The accusers pressed him, confident they had him cornered. He stood up. He looked them in the eye one by one. He didn't argue the law. He aimed for the conscience. "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." He bent down and continued writing. The silence shifted from anticipation to introspection. The statement was a mirror. Under the light of the great menorahs, their own darkness was exposed. The older men, who had more years of hidden sins, turned away first, then the younger ones. The thud of stones dropping from loosened grips echoed on the pavement. One by one, the shadows swallowed them up, until only Jesus and the woman were left. He stood up again. He looked at the woman not as a pawn, but as a person. "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, Lord," she whispered. "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on sin no more." He dismissed the sin without destroying the sinner. He walked on the chaos of human morality just as he had walked on the sea, rising above the binary trap of legalism and license. Then, standing near the great extinguishing lamps of the feast, Jesus spoke to the lingering crowd. The golden lamps were flickering out, their oil spent. The dawn was coming. "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." The claim was absolute. He was the water. He was the light. He was the I Am. The Pharisees were incandescent with rage. "You are bearing witness about yourself. Your testimony is not true." Jesus looked at them. "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am." This was it, the breaking point. Before Abraham was, I am. He claimed pre-existence. He claimed the divine name. The Pharisees scrambled for stones, not for the woman this time, but for him. They picked up the jagged rocks of the temple construction to crush the blasphemer. But just as he had passed by the disciples on the water, he passed through the midst of them. He hid himself. It was a supernatural evasion. One moment he was the target of a lynch mob. The next he was gone, slipping through the crowd like smoke, exiting the temple precincts. His hour had not yet come. The stones could not kill him until he laid down his life. As he walked away from the temple, escaping the violence, his attention was not on his own safety. It was on a beggar sitting by the gate beautiful. A man blind from birth. The disciples who had regrouped around him saw the man and asked a question that revealed they were still thinking like the villagers of Bethsaida. Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? They were still looking for the cause in the past. They saw suffering as a mathematical equation of sin and punishment. Jesus stopped. He had just escaped death. He was a wanted man, yet he paused for one broken person. It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. He spat on the ground and made mud with the saliva. It was an echo of the creation of Adam, dust and divine breath, earth and water. He anointed the man's eyes with the mud. It was a strange healing. He blinded the man further with dirt, asking him to trust in a process he couldn't see. Go, wash in the pool of Siloam, the pool of the water libation, the pool where the golden pitcher was filled. Jesus sent the man to the water. The man went. He fumbled his way through the streets, mud caked on his eyelids, the jeers of the crowd ringing in his ears. He reached the cool water. He washed. The mud dissolved, and the light flooded in. For the first time in his life he saw the sun, he saw the water, he saw his own hands. He returned to the temple courts, not as a beggar, but as a witness. The transformation was so total that his neighbors didn't recognize him. Is this the man who used to sit and beg? No, it just looks like him. I am the man, he insisted. The Pharisees hauled him in for interrogation. They were desperate to discredit the miracle. Give glory to God, we know that this man is a sinner. They tried to bully the beggar into denouncing Jesus, but the beggar, armed only with his experience, stood his ground against the theological giants. Whether he is a sinner I do not know. One thing I do know, that though I was blind now I see. He mocked them. He lectured them on theology. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. Furious, they cast him out of the synagogue. They excommunicated him. He paid the price for the light. Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he asked, "Do you believe in the Son of Man? And who is he, sir, that I may believe in him?" Jesus said to him, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you, Lord. I believe." And he worshipped him. The journey that began with a ghost on the water had led to this, worship. The disciples watched it all. They saw the hardening of the darkness in the Pharisees and the dawning of the light in the beggar. They realized that the storm they had survived on the lake was nothing compared to the storm that was coming. The lines were drawn. There was no middle ground anymore. You either picked up a stone to kill him, or you fell at his feet to worship him. Jesus led them out of Jerusalem, back across the Jordan to the place where John had been baptizing at first. He needed to rest. He needed to prepare them for the final act. But the respite would be short. A message was coming from Bethany, a message about a sick friend named Lazarus that would force them to return to the heart of the danger. The ghost who walked on water was about to confront the ghost of the grave. The night was coming indeed, but the light was burning brighter than ever. The message from Bethany arrived with the weight of a funeral dirge, disrupting the quiet refuge beyond the Jordan. Lazarus, the one whom Jesus loved, was sick. The disciples, still carrying the trauma of the stoned beggar and the violent threats in Jerusalem, expected an immediate rush to the bedside or a word of healing spoken from afar. Instead, they witnessed a terrifying stillness. Jesus waited. He allowed the sun to set and rise again, twice, while the life of his friend ebbed away into the silence of the grave. When he finally announced that they would return to Judea, the disciples felt the cold breath of death on their necks. Thomas, with the grim realism of a man who sees the storm coming but cannot stop the boat, voiced the collective resignation of the group, suggesting they go so they might die with him. They walked south not as healers, but as men marching toward a cliff edge, the dust of the road settling on them like ash. When they arrived in Bethany, the morning had already solidified into a ritual of despair. 4 days had passed. The tomb was sealed, the stone heavy and final. Martha's grief was palpable, a mixture of faith and frustration that echoed the disciples' own confusion in the boat. "If you had been here, my brother would not have died." It was the cry of every human heart facing the abyss. Jesus stood before the cave, the air thick with the scent of spices and decay, and he wept. He did not weep for the loss, for he knew what he was about to do. He wept for the devastation of death itself, the enemy he had come to destroy. He commanded the stone to be rolled away, exposing the darkness to the noon sun. Then, with a voice that vibrated with the same authority that had silenced the wind on the Sea of Galilee, he shouted into the void, "Lazarus, come out." The result was a shattering of natural law. The dead man shuffled into the light, bound in linen, blinking against the sun. He was no ghost. He was warm, solid, breathing proof that the Son of Man held the keys to death and Hades. The explosion of hope in Bethany lit the fuse for the final confrontation in Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin, terrified by the resurrection of Lazarus, finalized their decision. One man must die to save the nation. Jesus withdrew to the wilderness of Ephraim, pulling the 12 close for the final days of quiet before the Passover. When the time came, they ascended to the holy city, joining the river of pilgrims. The triumphal entry was a moment of delirious, deceptive joy. The crowds shouted Hosanna, waving palm branches, seeing in Jesus the conquering king who would break the Roman yoke. But the disciples, looking at the Master's face, saw no triumph, only a steely resolve. He was not riding to a coronation. He was riding into the eye of the hurricane. The week that followed was a blur of conflict and intimacy. The cleansing of the temple, the parables of judgment, the silent brooding of Judas Iscariot. Then came the upper room. Jesus washed their feet, stripping himself of his outer garments just as he would soon be stripped of his life. He spoke of his body as bread and his blood as wine, cementing the hard teaching of the synagogue in Capernaum into a covenant of grace. He predicted Peter's denial, a prophecy that struck the fishermen harder than the waves ever had. Then, in the dark of Gethsemane, the storm broke. The disciples slept, their heavy eyelids betraying them once again, while Jesus wrestled with the cup of wrath. The arrest was sudden and violent. A chaos of torches and steel. They all fled. The brave men who had rowed through the gale abandoned the ship when the true darkness fell. The crucifixion was the ultimate storm. For 3 hours, the sun failed, and the earth was plunged into a primal obsidian night. Jesus hung suspended between heaven and earth, becoming the lightning rod for the judgment of the world. He cried out, the sound tearing through the gloom, and then he breathed his last. The veil in the temple tore. The earth shook. The disciples, hiding behind locked doors in the city, felt the ground tremble and believed that all was lost. They were drowning again, sinking into a depth where no hand reached out to save them. The Sabbath passed in a silence so profound it felt like the end of history. The body lay in the tomb, wrapped in spices, guarded by Roman iron, but the dawn of the first day of the week brought a tremor that cracked the foundation of the world. The stone was rolled away, not by human hands, but by the power of indestructible life. The women found the tomb empty. Peter and John ran to the site, seeing the linen cloths lying flat, the cocoon empty of its butterfly. Confusion reigned until the evening when the disciples were gathered in the locked room, paralyzed by fear of the Jewish authorities. Suddenly, without a door opening, he was there. He stood among them, not as a memory, but as a presence. They recoiled, terrified, thinking they were seeing a spirit. The same terror they had felt on the stormy sea. It is a ghost, their minds screamed. But he spoke the words that anchored their souls. Peace be with you. He showed them his hands and his side, the scars still fresh, the marks of the nails proving his identity. Touch me and see, he urged, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones as you see that I have. He ate a piece of broiled fish before their eyes, a mundane act that shattered their disbelief. It was him. The ghost was God. The victim was the victor. In the weeks that followed, the reality of the resurrection reshaped their molecules. They met him in Galilee, by the sea where it all began. Peter, who had denied him 3 times by a charcoal fire, was restored by a charcoal fire on the beach, commissioned to feed the sheep of the Master. They stood on a mountain, perhaps the same one where he had fed the 5,000, and received the final command, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations." The fear was gone. The men who had screamed at a phantom on the water were now ready to face emperors, armies, and executioners. The final departure took place on the Mount of Olives. He lifted his hands and blessed them, and as he did, he was lifted up. A cloud received him out of their sight, not a storm cloud, but the Shekinah glory of the Father. They stood gazing into the sky, no longer afraid of the distance between them. They knew now that he was not passing them by. He had promised, "I am with you always, to the end of the age." They returned to Jerusalem with great joy. The boat of their lives had finally found its harbor. They knew that the wind might blow and the waves might rise and the darkness might threaten to swallow them again. But they also knew that the man who walks on water, the one who conquered the grave, was not a ghost to be feared, but a savior to be trusted. The night was over. The light of the world had risen, and the dawn would never end.